for this, I had done up a sketch, a little gift during my vacation, so I figured I will use that as my full example. So I went and inked it. I'll do a more in-depth tutorial on that some other time. And laid down my flat colors and the markings and whatnot. So when I first started coloring, I used to, select this layer, create a new layer, and then start drawing shading just on top of it like that. I have recently come into the super appreciation of clipping masks. Used to use them a lot in Photoshop, but just never really got into it in Sci. But if I ever have to change anything, if I'm working on a commission and they ask me to tweak something and it goes outside what I've currently shaded, much easier to already have that shading layer down and you can just continue on than having to redo bits and pieces here and there. So, as I showed in my Sci tutorial on Friday, I went through a bunch of the layer modes and everything. So commonly, people use the multiply layer as their primary shading technique. You can do things many different ways. Different layer modes give you different effects. But for this, I'll be sticking with multiply for my shadows. It makes things darker, so it makes sense to use that for shading. I normally pick a color that's got, it's on the, closer to gray, but just slightly in the color. So it gives a little bit of you can make things look warm or cold, or accentuate certain colors on the character, etc. So for this time, I'm not going to pick purple or blue because it will pull out too much of the color on the character currently because she uses those colors, so I'm going to use a red. So I'm going to go over cell shading, which is more or less what you see in like animations and stuff like that, where it's just very solid shading. You can color them in however you wish. Some people prefer this method, just literally laying it on. And some people prefer to erase away. That is my current method of choice. But cell shading is pretty simple. It's picking the darkest parts of the picture and bringing it out, making things look a little more three-dimensional without going super crazy. You can make a picture look pretty awesome with cell shading. It's very, cell shading is better if you want to do something like high impact visually, or if you want something that would look better for things you have to reduce the size for, so icons and stuff like that. They're normally they normally look a little bit better if you don't go into full shading, just because when you reduce it you lose a lot of your details. Flat colors and cell shading like this helps keep things very crisp and to the point, so that when you reduce a file it still holds that detail. Also good if you wanted something anime-esque or cartoon-esque, since most cartoons don't have soft shading of any kind. That would be murder on the animators having to do very specific soft shading on everything. So just simply put, that's, one method of shading. If you wanted to smooth things out a little bit, inside, most programs have some kind of a blender brush or a something of that kind. Like some of them have, they don't have a specific blend brush, but they'll have like a watercolor or a marker brush that has blending properties so that you can drag your color out and make it softer. I'll go more in depth into some of the soft shading when I go through my method, but you can take a blender brush and just go over parts and smooth it out if you wanted something a little less solid looking. And keep in mind that not all shadows that a body casts will be like a line. It won't be a flat line. Shadows do blur out. But also keeping in mind that looking at photo references of people and seeing how if you're doing something, if your style of drawing is something that is less fur texture everywhere and, you know, smoother, like this character here has skin and scales instead of really fluffy fur, but you can see how skin at the folds or in places where little light can reach are actually darker than most of the other shadows cast. I'll go into a little bit more of that shortly. But yes, so my primary method of shading is I will put down a full layer of color. Multiply. Oh, I've got a little bit outside the lines there, don't I? That's okay. There we go. I like to erase away when I color. I find it easier for me to blend my colors with soft shading when I start from the darkest, or one of the darker colors, and then erase away to form my light. So in this case, let's say I want some really dynamic lighting, and I want the lighting to like come from some light source over here. Oops, let's not go over the picture. Sometimes, I know I used to do this a lot, but it helps me visualize, or helps me understand where light will hit a form if I actually... You'll notice this in a lot of the time animation cells when they're doing their sketches and whatnot for animation. You will actually see colored lines that are representative of where the shading goes and where the highlights go. It's actually a pretty helpful technique because if the highlights, or if the light is coming from that side, then you can actually map out where shading, or where the light might actually hit. And of course, you don't have to be like super precise on this. Fudging some of the lighting does sometimes make it look better, but knowing where light would realistically hit first, it's like anatomy. If you understand basic anatomy and can draw more or less anatomically correct, then after that you can start teaching yourself how to stylize things. You learn the rules and then break them. But as you can see, there's just some basic outlines of where some of the lighting might go. And you can bring that out by taking an eraser brush, and you can use whatever kind of brush you want. I use the soft one. It's not the default that I got in Anta's brush pack, but it's been warped over the years. But I use it And I just pull away the main area of where that highlight would hit. You don't need to go super crazy, just blocking out where you want your light to go. Etc. And you can see it's kind of taken a little bit of shape. I like to go into the edges of my erased areas and actually take my blender brush and smooth it out a little bit. In the end, I normally duplicate my shading layer to make it a little bit darker, and you can fiddle with it however you prefer. So for instance, in Psi, I would press Alt-LC, and that duplicates that current layer. As you can see, it deepens my shading a little bit. I normally pull it back a little bit with the opacity layer, or the function, and then I will go in after that and create a new layer, multiply, and I will actually go in and accentuate some of the parts that would be perhaps a little bit either too far away or not enough light would actually get there, so it would be a little bit darker. So this would be kind of my version of adding some kind of cell shading, but I normally blur parts of it. Not all of it. You still, at least for me, I like having some crisp corners because it actually shows there's like a ridge there, something that would cast a shadow. But blurring it a little bit so it's not super sharp is how I would normally go. And keep in mind that just because light source is coming from one side, it doesn't mean that that's the only place that light will show. In real life, if you look at pictures of people in a setting, even dramatic lighting where light is only coming from one side, light will actually reflect off the surfaces around your subject, and you will actually get a little bit of a kind of a backlighting on the character. And these will be much softer than the main lighting, of course, because they're traveling, you know, from the other side of the room or from an object nearby. And even reflecting off the character itself. It really depends on how in-depth you want to get with that. But let's say, you know, there's a wall on one side. So the light would be bouncing off her or going past her, bouncing off the wall, and then reflecting back on her. And so you'd get a little bit of a glow on this side. And for me, when I'm doing this, you don't have to worry about being super precise with your shading, because when you overlay highlights or put highlights on top, however you choose to do it, it normally smooths out any rough patches in the erased area. Of course, sometimes you might have to go back and fix something because you notice it's just not sitting right, but most of the time you don't have to worry too much about that kind of thing. It also helps with backlighting for me sometimes as well, creating those two different layers that I have on Multiply, picking one and doing the highlights just on that one layer so it looks like it's a lot softer than the other one. Of course, you can use different eraser brushes or use just take a hard eraser and just do the very, very edge and then smooth it out and work with it that way. It really depends on what tools you prefer to use. Of course, with this character, we've got these lovely eye and horn and scale markings, and they glow. That's why they're in a different layer. But these markings glow, so they would cause, they would have their own light, however little, or however much you want, depending on the character design. So you would have to take into account that some of that color would also be shining on other parts of the character as well. So if I take the color that those markings are, and I create a new layer above those markings, and I will take, an airbrush for some of these markings. And I would go over the general area that the markings are and create a glow effect. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. Now, of course, I always try to put a little bit of a lighter color in the middle of the glow just to accentuate when something is close to the source. So a little bit of a lighter blue, just right in the center of the glow. I find it gives it a little bit of depth. Now, keeping that in mind, you now have this other light source. You can see some of the glow is already forming on other parts of the character. So light coming from the eye would reflect off the edges of parts of the character nearby. So the scales would get an extra little bit of glow. Alright, and then the horns are giving off a glow all the way up. So you would probably get a little bit of that color on the edge of the scales here, and possibly a little bit on the scales on the back. You can basically just take a line out from where the light source is coming from and more or less see where the light might actually hit. So she's all shiny now. And if you feel that any of the light is too rigid, you can always soften it up with your blender tool if it's not sitting quite right the way you want it. The pupils, since they are white, I'm going to give them a little bit more of a white glow in the center. And a little bit of that showing up in the very, very corners. So you have a basic sense of the character's form just by pulling out some of the shadow where you think the highlights would hit. So I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to redo the shading, but I'm going to do it from the front just to show a different perspective of light. From the front, it's harder to, like, you can't just put a dot off to the side and be like, okay, well, this part would hit with this light, etc. You have a lot more surface area from the front that would have light coming towards it. So if you wanted to go back and do the little highlight method that I was showing before, where did I put the Ah, markings were missing those, okay. Boop. There we go. If you wanted to do the method that I was using before and do it from, you know, the front, you would get more general highlights on the other side. You get the basic idea there. You get some light in here and some light in here, etc., etc. So, creating my multiply layer again, I will lay down my full layer clipping mask of the shading color, and I will take my soft eraser and start pulling out the highlights. So with the light coming from the front, you would get a little bit of a shadow coming from the muzzle here. But I normally go through with my highlights and just highlight it without putting in any shadows right off the bat. I actually go back in and edit the layer a little bit before I create a duplicate and then go into the deeper shading parts. I will explain that when I get there. Here there would be shadow cast from the scales onto the chest, but those will get put in shortly. It's easier to put in the full lighting effects from how much light would go through beyond those shadows. Like in between your fingers, light would still shine through. So it's easier to highlight the whole area that would be getting some light and then color in the shadows, the cast shadows afterwards. At least for me anyways. Because then you'll still have the full brightness of the in-between areas that wouldn't be casting shadows. But there are some tricks to making it more obvious that it has a ridge, and I will go into that in a little bit later. And don't forget to think about reflected light. So if the light's coming from, you know, out in the general area out here, then light would be going behind her and reflecting back. So on areas that might not be getting a whole lot of light, they might have a small shine to indicate some reflected light. Same with the scales and stuff too. The different layers of the character would be getting some of that backlighting. And you can definitely have more than one light source in your pictures. I know there have been a couple images that I've done that I've purposefully had 2 different colored light sources just for effect. And they can make for some pretty interesting pictures. So right now I'm going through and I'm blending some of my highlighted areas, give it a more, a softer feel. And you don't have to do this. This is just my personal preference. I know a lot of people who do their shading and highlighting, and they make it kind of look a little more like it's been painted. And they leave those stroke lines in there, which is still pretty awesome. It's a really nice texture to have, so it really just depends on your personal preference in the end and what you would like to do with the picture that you are working on. When I work, I normally work with one lighting source at a time, because each lighting source will cast its own shadows. And some of them will not necessarily cancel each other out, but they might alter the shadows cast by the other light source. So if you've got one light source coming from one side and there's a little bit of a ridge and it's casting a little bit of a shadow, a light from the other side might not necessarily cancel out that shadow entirely, but it would soften it. It really depends on what kind of lighting you're going for. And I try to, at least in some areas, I don't blend both sides of the highlight that I'm doing. I will only do part of it, one side of it. I don't always have a method to which side I do. Sometimes it depends on if it's, if something comes to a crease, I will leave the crease sharper and then blend out the other side. If it's a shadow cast like under the neck, I would blend out the bottom a little bit, because the further away the shadow gets from the actual source of the shadow, the fuzzier or lighter it will get. It's like if you look at yourself standing outside, you'll notice that your shadow that you cast when the sun is shining might blur out a little bit, just because you might be casting that shadow, but it doesn't mean that there isn't other light reflecting elsewhere and softening it from a different angle. So alright, so I have my basic layer of shading down, or highlights, I should say. And I want to go in and I want to enhance some of the shadows around objects that are close together or what have you. So I'm going to go in and I've changed my pen to my regular inker pen, and I'm just going to go in and reinforce some of the shadows I lost during my blending. These aren't going to be super noticeable at the moment, but I do some other stuff in the future of the image that will push the darks a little bit more to create a more three-dimensional feel. Not all of the shadows that I'm doing right now are necessarily correct. Your shading might not always be completely realistic, but let's face it, realistic isn't always, doesn't always look correct. Like, have you ever taken a picture and realized, man, you know, my arm looks really weird from that angle? Real life can look kind of silly sometimes. Our proportions can do a lot of weird things, or our bodies can do a lot of weird things, so our proportions look a little off. So, fudging a little bit of your shading isn't a bad thing. It's also part of figuring out what kind of effects and what kind of style you want to go for when you are coming into the area of shading. I know I did a lot of sketching and inks and stuff before I really started coloring anything when I was younger, so everybody gets to that comfort zone eventually. It all comes down to experimenting and finding out what you really prefer, what works for you, what makes the most sense. And always keep trying. It's easy to get frustrated, and you know, if you've got to take a break from something, do so. But I always try to come back to what I've done and try to expand on it in some way so that at least I can understand what I did and maybe what I want to improve upon. I've done many different coloring and shading techniques over the years, and not all of them have stuck, not all of them I've fully understood. Some of them just don't click as well as others, so you do whatever you're comfortable with. Okay, so I've done my basic lighting, or my basic shading, and I'm going to Alt-L-C again and copy that layer to make it darker. Some people have asked me why I don't just use a darker color. I don't have as much freedom with my shading using a darker color. It can be misleading sometimes for me, so I use a lighter color somewhere between middle of the spectrum towards white, and then if I have to and I want to push those darks again, then I can just always copy my layer. But when you make it dark, too dark the first time, sometimes it's hard to really get the blending that you want. It depends on the program that you use and what kind of techniques you use, but that is what I find. I find it just does not work as well for me. And you'll notice sometimes when you go over that layer again with the copied layer that some of the areas might not be lit as well as you would hope. Some of them are brighter than others. Like right now, the other side of the face looks brighter than the part of the face that should have the most lighting, so I just go in and tweak that a little bit. Alright, so I do a little bit of cell shading in my techniques a little bit. For the areas that cast significant shadows, I guess, or in areas that I want to emphasize a difference of some kind, so the head should stand out a little bit because that is your primary focal point, is like the eyes of the creature. So I always put a little bit of a shadow under the neck, with the exception of if the lighting is actually coming from below. Right now the lighting is kind of coming on, I try to do it more center, so it's kind of coming from out here a little bit and then coming in. So it's in the middle of the plane. But I'm still going to put a shadow under the neck a little bit just for emphasis of that area. High contrast areas will get people's attention, and so if you have a particular place that you want them to focus on, sometimes putting a little bit more shading than might normally happen helps them actually focus there, and you can kind of determine how the viewer, where the viewer first looks when they view your piece. I'm making quite big shadows down here, not because I'm actually planning on, making those really crisp shadows, but because those, they are a bit of a triangular bridge, like they come up in the middle. I'm going to use this layer of shading as the means to try to create the illusion that they come up a little bit. So I lay out some dark shading colors, and then I will blend them so that it looks like they recede a little bit. This would be casting a little bit of a shadow. I like to go in certain areas of my shading and blend parts of it. So, now that I've done that, oftentimes I will go in and reinforce other shadows and whatnot, but we'll see how the rest of the picture goes before I do that. So now I'm getting into the actual highlights. I'm thinking I want to use, just like the shadow, I'm going to use a reddish color. In this case, it's going to come out more pink because it's a desaturated color, but I'm going to make a new layer on top of my shading layers that are multiply, and I'm going to make this an overlay layer. Overlay brightens the color underneath, so I find that it makes the pictures a little more rich, whereas screen or just doing a normal layer would actually desaturate the colors a lot more. So, with the lighting still coming from the same area, I go in with an airbrush this time, and I start bringing out the highlights a little bit more. And as you can see, some of the areas of the initial shading that I had done where the areas were not quite smooth, you could see some rough patches in them. When you go over it with your highlight layer, it normally just smooths things out, so you don't have to be too much of a perfectionist smoothing things out if you want things to look smooth. And then bringing out the shadows on the other side of the face and trying to keep in mind not to make them brighter than the other side, because these would be farther away from the light source than this side of the face. And just for the sake of saying it, using references is not a bad thing. Look at photos, take your own photos if you want. Go out, do some people watching. You'll learn a lot about form and a lot about lighting, how different kinds of lighting affects the mood, etc. It's a good learning experience. I haven't gone out and done a whole lot of people watching, but the occasional times that I have, and I've just gone to the mall for the sake of going to the mall and just being elsewhere other than my home, you just take your sketchbook with you. Sit on the bench, relax, you know, have a drink of choice, normally tea for me. And you just kind of, you know, as people walk by, think about the motion that they are currently taking, if they're walking or they're sitting, and do some quick sketches. And you can also block out, or blot in different light sources and stuff, and seeing how it affects. You can go into or look at stores that have cool lighting effects for their displays and stuff, and you can actually see how it affects them. The mannequins and stuff in Windows help quite a lot in that case. They don't move, so you have all the time in the world to just look at them and do whatever. And if you view them from different angles, you can see how the light looks from different angles, or from the viewer's point of view, anyways. Okay, so basic shading. I'm looking at part of my picture and I'm not liking how I'm missing some shading in some areas, so I created a new multiply layer, and I'm just going to go in with my airbrush again and reinforce some of the shading. Alright, so on another overlay layer, above the overlay layer you were just highlighting on, this is where, if I was drawing a furry creature, I would be using my marker brush and going over some of the fur texture to kind of bring out the fur's highlights a little bit. In this case, this character is scaled and has skin-like attributes, so it is colored a little bit differently. I'm going to first go over the scale plate areas with a general hotspot shine. Since they are of a shiny texture, they would have a more prominent hotspot. You do get hotspots on skin, predominantly if a person is recently been out in the rain, or if they have oily skin, then they will have certain hot spots if you're trying to take a picture of them. You might notice it on their nose or their cheeks or their forehead. Sometimes the chin, depending on the person, but you can find some pretty cool tutorials on online about skin texture and stuff like that. I'm not going to go too crazy. Putting a little bit of it's not really backlighting, just a little extra on the other edge of the part of the scale that would also be in direct light, just to push that lighted side a little bit more. Right here, since there is a dip in the scale, it kind of is a little bit leaf-shaped, so it comes down a little bit. It gets thinner in the middle. The lighting here would actually also be seen right after the crease, where it starts to come back up again, where it would actually hit the other light, or the light source would hit the other side. So you can see how that's brought out some of the lighting values on the picture. I am going to blend a few of them just to, I don't want them to end so harshly. So the light would hit this part right here a little bit heavier since it's at a point. And then I would just blend out a little bit of the rest of it just to make it seem. So now, because the character is skin and scales, which is more reflective than, let's say, fur, for instance, I would create another overlay layer, same color, and I want to bring out some of the darkest areas with just a line along the line art. Just to show some backlighting or reflected light coming from other parts of the creature. So the light's coming towards here and has a hotspot on this scale piece right here. Well, the light that hits that is gonna bounce off and possibly hit other objects around it. So you would get a little bit of an extra shine. And so now the final touches, similar to what I was doing, I'm just going to turn on the layers again. So the glow, I'm actually going to make that overlay and bring it back just a little bit. So that was all done with airbrush, same color as the markings, and bringing out the highlight of the eyes there. And I'm just doing another overlay layer, and or not. Ah, there we go. Overlay layer, and just go through some of that with some white, accentuate the magical electricity stuff, buzzing with power. I'm actually going to bring that above the line art. And that's all she wrote, folks. Alright, everyone, thank you for joining in. I hope that this was helpful in some way.